The heavy Chicago air suffocated Ramon, an app-based driver in his early 30s, with perpetually disheveled dark hair and eyes that betrayed countless sleepless nights. His exhaustive routine rarely made room for the unusual, until one gray autumn afternoon, he drove his car into the seldom-used Ogden Avenue tunnel. The hum of his engine echoed off the damp walls. Suddenly, a vision, not the exit, but a wall of mangled, twisted cars, enveloped in a greenish-yellow gas that seemed to drain the light itself. The smell of burning metal and something sweet and suffocating invaded his nostrils, a chilling shiver running down his spine. He wasn't just seeing. He was feeling death. Ramon's silent scream echoed only within his head, a mute torment reverberating in his eardrums, louder than the engine's roar. Managed to convince a few more indecisive drivers to turn back, grudgingly, with grumbles of irritation and phrases like, "I hope this is worth it." Most, however, impatient and incredulous at the apparent hysteria, drove forward, muttering about a crazy person's tantrum and wasting time on nonsense. Impotence corroded Ramon, a corrosive sensation that burned in his stomach and his soul, a slow poison spraying through his veins. He tried with all his might to prevent what seemed inevitable, but fate, he felt, had more than one card up its sleeve, and seemed to be enjoying his despair in a cruel game of cat and mouse where he was the mouse. Minutes later, the sharp, rising sound of sirens pierced the cold afternoon air, growing closer and more deafening, announcing the arrival of authorities. Firefighters, police cars, ambulances with their lights flashing frantically, illuminating the scene with shades of red and blue. The tunnel was quickly cordoned off with yellow tape and police vehicles that completely blocked the entrance. Structural cracks. The news reports crackled on Mike's car radio, who was still parked there, observing the scene with an expression of surprise, relief, and a newfound respect for his friend. Ramon breathed a sigh of relief, cold sweat trickling down his forehead, feeling his knees buckle and dizziness almost knocking him over. The first trap had been avoided, but the sense of danger, a chilling tingle on the back of his neck that wouldn't leave him, was proof that the fight was far from over. It was as if death was laughing somewhere, a silent, sarcastic laugh, mocking his small victory and preparing its next move, more cunning, more cruel. The cold autumn wind whipped at his face, and the smell of Chicago's pollution seemed to carry a metallic and sweet tang, nauseatingly reminiscent of the gas he had seen in his terrifying Premonition, a constant and suffocating reminder of what he had narrowly avoided. In a surge of pure adrenaline, which made his muscles scream and his temples throb, he slammed on the emergency brake with desperate, instinctual force, his tires screeching stridently in the tunnel's damp darkness, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of silence and normalcy. His car, a white sedan already somewhat battered and with a few scratches on its bodywork, spun awkwardly on the wet asphalt, its dazzling taillights illuminating the entrance he had just left behind. Now a portal to Ramon's personal hell. His heart hammered erratically and painfully against his ribs, a furious drumbeat of fear, while the nauseating smell of the Premonition still lingered in his nostrils. An olfactory memory so vivid it felt almost tangible, clinging to his mind like hot, corrosive glue. He pulled his phone from the dashboard mount, his hands trembling so violently that the screen shook uncontrollably in his peripheral vision, and dialed 911, the numbers blurred by his tears and the cold sweat that streamed down his face. His voice choked with urgency, almost a hoarse, desperate whisper. He managed to stammer, "There's a terrible accident. In the Ogden Tunnel, toxic gas. Please, send help." Quickly, the operator, her voice strangely too calm for the situation, almost irritatingly monotonous in her robotic professionalism, asked about injuries. But Ramon couldn't answer. The words stuck in his throat like stones, suffocating him. He could only see the silent bodies in his vision, piled like broken dolls, their empty eyes fixed on a distant, terrifying point. Desperate, he turned around. honking hysterically at the cars approaching the tunnel, their headlights blinding him for an instant. The sound of other horns mingling with the chaos in his mind, amplifying his torment. A young woman with colorful headphones in the back seat of a neighboring Uber, oblivious to the imminent danger, seemed impatient, gesturing for him to move out of the way, complaining loudly about the delay. Ramon gesticulated frantically, his eyes wide and bloodshot, the veins in his neck bulging, shouting until his throat hurt and grew raw. "Don't go in! Don't go into the tunnel! It's a trap! It's dangerous! Please, turn back!" A fellow driver, Mike, a stocky man in his early 40s with a baseball cap turned backward, always with an easy smile and a carefree air, rolled down his window, the sound of his engine muffled by the growing commotion. "What the hell, Ramon? Are you crazy? You're blocking the entrance, man. You're gonna cause a hell of a traffic jam." Ramon approached Mike's window, his voice almost a hoarse whisper, but carrying an intensity that would chill anyone. "Mike, please, listen to me. I saw it. A horrible accident, gas, everyone. Dead in there. You have to turn back. Now, please, trust me." Mike frowned, skeptical, the smile vanishing from his face and giving way to an expression of confusion and slight fear. But the desperate intensity in Ramon's eyes, the seriousness he had never seen in his friend, made him hesitate, a deep wrinkle of concern crossing his forehead. Other drivers stopped, curious and visibly irritated by the sudden blockage. Some honking furiously, their faces contorted in frustration and impatience. The fog that always covered Chicago seemed denser that day, a gray, oppressive veil that swallowed the skyscrapers, making the environment even more somber and claustrophobic, as if the city itself was closing in on them. Ramon, with Mike's reluctant help, who still seemed to doubt his friend's sanity, but accepted the urgency of his plea. The night brought temporary relief, but no sleep. Ramon tossed and turned in bed. It didn't stay on every newspaper's front page for long, but the app-based driver community began to whisper, each murmur an echo of terror, a seed of fear planted in previously carefree hearts, a macabre mystery. Strange deaths in open spaces, under Chicago's blue sky, without apparent explanation, defying logic. Paranoia began to settle in Ramon, a cold, persistent fog that obscured his mind, turning every shadow and every sound into a potential enemy. He avoided crowds, preferring deserted routes, the secondary and little-traveled streets, where the silence was almost palpable and he could breathe without fear. Every cough from a passenger, every morning fog that unexpectedly appeared in the air, every breeze that passed made him hold his breath, his heart pounding in his chest, a drum of anxiety, a ticking countdown. He vividly remembered the sweet and metallic smell of his vision, a scent of death that seemed to follow him like an inescapable shadow, clinging to his clothes and his skin, no matter how much he rubbed or washed. One afternoon, picking up a passenger in the Loop, Chicago's pulsating financial center, a gigantic traffic jam formed on Michigan Avenue, a sea of stopped cars and impatient honks. The sheets tangled and damp with cold sweat, the images of the pileup repeating in his mind like a horror movie on a loop, impossible to pause or turn off. The smell of the gas seemed to permeate his simple apartment in the Lincoln Park neighborhood, each breath bringing back the nauseating sensation of asphyxiation, a suffocation that felt real, tightening his throat. He got up, his throat dry, and went to the window, looking at the flickering city lights, which seemed to mock him in their apparent tranquility, so oblivious to his internal torment. Peace, he knew, was a fragile illusion, about to shatter at any moment, like thin glass. The next morning, the car radio, which he still forced himself to use out of habit, but at an almost inaudible volume, delivered the news that chilled his blood, solidifying it like pure ice. 6 bodies found on the street in Wicker Park, all with signs of asphyxiation. The cause of death is still unknown, but there's no indication of gas at the scene. 6. The same number of people he had tried to warn in the tunnel, those who refused to turn back, who ignored him. Except, to his surprise and momentary relief, Mike. He dialed his friend, his hands trembling so much he almost dropped the phone on the car floor, his voice choked with emotion and fear. "Mike, are you ... Are you okay?" "I heard the news ... Mike answered, his voice sleepy and confused, still on the edge of sleep, but with a tone of relief. "Yeah, man." "Why wouldn't I be? Did something happen?" "You sound strange, stranger than usual." Raymond sighed, a bittersweet relief mingling with the bitterness of another's tragedy, a bitter taste in his mouth. Those 6 deaths, inexplicable and brutal, in such common and seemingly harmless settings, were a direct affront to his heroism, irrefutable proof that death could not be so easily cheated, that it would find its way, no matter how far one went or how well he tried to warn others. Death had found another route. The news didn't spread like wildfire. Deafening horns, impatient drivers cursing into the wind, the exhaust fumes filling the air, making it dense and heavy. Raymond felt an overwhelming pressure in his chest, as if an invisible weight was upon him, crushing his lungs and stealing his breath. It was the same suffocating urgency he had felt in the tunnel, a sharp premonition that something was about to happen. He looked at the passenger in the back seat, a hurried businessman in his impeccable suit, who consulted his wristwatch with obvious impatience, huffing and muttering. "Sir, I need to take a detour. Traffic is completely stopped ahead, and it doesn't look like it will move anytime soon. Can we take a side street, a faster one? I feel we should." The businessman, impatient and visibly irritated by the suggestion, replied sharply, his voice cutting and authoritative. "I don't have time for detours, young man. Just go straight. I have an important meeting in a few minutes." Raymond insisted, his voice almost a desperate plea, charged with a supernatural conviction that even scared himself. "Please, it's important. I feel we shouldn't stay here. There's something very wrong in the air, believe me." The businessman looked at him with disdain, his brow furrowed, a mix of irritation and curiosity in his gaze, but Raymond's persistence and intensity, a spark of fear deep in the driver's eyes, made him reluctantly give in, letting out an exasperated sigh and a, "Do what you want, but just get me there, quickly." He abruptly turned the car to take a side street, passing through tight, damp alleys with graffitied walls and the smell of trash, the engine rumbling a low, constant sound, almost a lament. Minutes later, he heard alarming news on the car radio, confirming his worst fears, chilling his blood again. An unknown gas leak had occurred on Michigan Avenue, precisely where they had been stopped moments before. Several people were hospitalized with severe respiratory difficulties, some in critical condition, at risk of death. Raymond felt a knot in his throat, cold sweat trickling down his neck, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He had escaped again, but each time the traps became more subtle, more insidious, more difficult to predict, almost impossible. Death seemed to adapt, learning from his attempts to escape, becoming more cunning and relentless, a predator that never gives up. The air around him seemed to vibrate with an oppressive, almost tangible energy, and the wind, even faint, sounded like a threatening whisper, the icy voice of perdition refusing to leave him alone. Raymond knew that with each escape, he was only buying time, and the clock was ticking, minute by minute, like sand slipping through his fingers. With each averted premonition, Raymond's mind became an intricate labyrinth of anxiety and paranoia, every thought a dead end, every street corner a new potential trap. Hoping to be less conspicuous and blend into the environment at a gas station in Naperville, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white and aching. The physical pain almost welcomed to distract from the internal agony and terror that gnawed at him. The images of the fire, the chaos, the despair of people running and screaming were too vivid, seared into his mind, repeating endlessly, a visual torture. He had escaped by seconds, an infinitesimal fraction of time, a terrifying miracle that only amplified his dread. Death was getting closer, its sharp claws grazing his skin, almost pulling him into its cold, inevitable embrace, feeling its icy breath. He didn't understand why, the reason he was being pursued by this relentless curse, by this invisible entity that seemed to take pleasure in his torment. He wasn't a hero, just an app-based driver trying to survive, an ordinary man caught in a nightmare with no end. With each escape, the momentary satisfaction was quickly replaced by an even greater, deeper, more paralyzing terror. Each time, fate seemed to whisper to him in a macabre, icy tone, "You can run, but you can't hide. I will always find you, no matter where you go." The air around him seemed to vibrate with an oppressive, almost tangible energy. A weight on his shoulders, and the wind, even faint, sounded like a threatening whisper, a lullaby of doom, an invitation to the end he so desperately tried to avoid. Death was closing in, an invisible but suffocating siege, and he no longer knew where to go, which direction to take to save himself from a fate that seemed sealed and irreversible. A quiet and seemingly harmless town on the outskirts of Chicago. The strong, pungent smell of gasoline mingled with something sweet and metallic. The same nauseating sensation that had haunted him since the Ogden Avenue tunnel, an unmistakable sign that turned his stomach. He looked around, his heart pounding fiercely in his chest like an uncontrolled drum, almost exploding, ready to leap from his mouth. Nothing, just the monotonous routine of the gas station. Cars coming and going, people casually talking on their phones, the constant hum of the fuel pumps, the whirring of the air compressor. But the premonition was overwhelming, an internal siren screaming, "Danger! Get out of here!" so loudly that he almost thought the attendant could hear his thoughts. He dropped the nozzle with a thud, the metal hitting the ground with a hollow sound. The attendant, a young man with pimples and an oil-stained shirt, looked at him strangely. "Problem, sir? Did you forget something? You look pale as a ghost." Ramon shook his head, unable to formulate a coherent answer. The words stuck in his dry, hoarse throat, a tight knot. He got into the car in a hurry, the key trembling in his hand, the engine starting with a sound that seemed muffled and distant, as if the world were becoming a mute, inaudible echo. As soon as he accelerated out of the gas station, his tires briefly screeching on the hot asphalt, he heard a deafening roar that violently shook the car, jostling him in his seat. He looked in the rearview mirror, the shock freezing the blood in his veins. A colossal explosion. The gas station was in flames, a ball of orange and red fire illuminating the gray afternoon sky, black smoke rising in a thick, threatening column, like an accusing finger pointing skyward. He stopped driving at night. The fear of what the darkness might conceal consumed him, of the shadows that might harbor new invisible threats waiting in the corner. His eyes, once merely tired from his exhaustive routine, were now constantly wide, searching for signs, for suspicious smoke on the horizon, for strange smells that might announce the next deadly trap. He distanced himself from colleagues, including Mike, whose calls he refused to answer, fearing that his mere presence might somehow attract misfortune to them, like an invisible, contagious plague. Solitude became his constant companion, a heavy burden he carried on his slumped shoulders, a self-imposed isolation. Ramon's life became an incessant flight from an invisible enemy, a shadow dancing at his periphery, always one step ahead, always observing his movements, awaiting the right moment. One day, while fueling his car now, a different model and dark, almost gray, Ramon pulled the car abruptly to the side of the road. Exhaustion consumed Ramon, transforming him into a mere husk of himself, a labyrinth of terror. The bus made a mandatory stop at an isolated gas station somewhere in Kansas under a deep blue, cloudless sky, the sun high and scorching, shining mercilessly. Ramon got off to stretch his legs, his steps heavy and hesitant. the dry midday heat contrasting sharply with Chicago's suffocating humidity. A change almost welcome for his body, but not for his soul. He walked to the convenience store, the warm desert breeze on his face, and grabbed a bottle of cold water, the plastic sweating in his hand. As he approached the counter to pay, the store's air conditioning let out a blast of cool, damp air, and with it, the smell. Sweet, metallic, the unmistakable smell of death that followed him. Even in the middle of the desert, miles from any city, Ramon froze, the water bottle almost slipping from his trembling hands, which gripped the counter. He looked at the attendant, a man with a thick mustache and a gentle smile, who looked back at him with curiosity, noticing nothing wrong, oblivious to the terror that had invaded and paralyzed him. Nothing seemed out of place. But the premonition was too strong to ignore, an internal siren blaring in his mind, louder than any external sound. The metropolis, once his welcoming home, was now a cramped cage, with every street, every building, every person seeming like a potential threat, an agent of death. Letting him fall to the floor with a metallic clink. As he left the store, his eyes frantically scanned the area, and he noticed a small, colorless gas leak from a rusty propane tank, barely visible behind an old, dirty delivery truck parked there, blocking most people's view. The smell hadn't come from the air conditioning, as he first thought, but from the treacherous breeze that entered through the store's door, bringing death with it in every invisible particle. If he had stayed a few more seconds inside, the exposure would have been fatal, irreversible, and there would have been no one to warn him. He ran back to the bus, a desperate sprint, ignoring the curious and confused stares of the other passengers who looked at him strangely. He threw himself into his seat, gasping, his heart pounding like a furious hammer in his chest. The bus driver, oblivious to the danger lingering in the air, called for passengers to return. The bus departed, leaving behind the gas station and the invisible threat. Ramon closed his eyes, exhausted, feeling the weight of the pursuit in every fiber of his being, with every beat of his heart, every painful breath. No matter where he went, death seemed to know his whereabouts, as if connected to him by an invisible thread, by a macabre bond. It was patient, persistent, and he was beginning to doubt he could truly cheat it. The mental exhaustion was almost as dangerous as the traps themselves, eroding his sanity with each passing day, turning him into an empty shell. He bought a bus ticket west, to the vast, empty landscapes of Arizona, hoping that the immensity of the desert might dilute the pursuit that afflicted him, make him invisible to death's eyes, like a speck of dust in the wind. The bus, crowded and noisy, smelling of sweat, cheap food, and diesel, traversed the monotonous plains of the American Midwest under a sky that seemed endless. Ramon sat by the window, watching the landscape slowly transform. The green of the cities giving way to the brown and red of the rocks, to the relentless dryness of the land, the vastness engulfing him. He tried to convince himself that he was safe, that he had escaped, that death would finally leave him in peace. His movements slow and dragging, his eyes dull and sunken, carrying the weight of hundreds of sleepless nights and a constant, crushing fear. Each dawn was a bittersweet reminder that he had survived another day, but also a harbinger of new and unpredictable threats, a silent countdown that inevitably led to his end. With every tick of life's clock, every tick-tock nearing zero, he stopped looking for stable work. The fear of staying in one place for too long consumed him, like a slow fever, eroding his ability to concentrate and live a normal life. He lived off sporadic, low-paying odd jobs, just enough to eat and have a temporary roof over his head, always in cheap, isolated motels with thin walls and the smell of mold, leaving no trace, always one step ahead of an invisible enemy. Nights were filled with vivid nightmares of the tunnel, of the suffocating greenish-yellow gas, of the deaths he had witnessed and those he had narrowly avoided. The figure of death, once a cold and distant abstraction, now had a face in his mind, a cold, relentless countenance, with empty eyes that haunted him even when he was awake in broad daylight, wherever he was. Raymond decided to leave Chicago, the city that had become his private prison, but the escape was a fragile illusion, about to disintegrate into 1,000 pieces. He paid for the water, his hands trembling so much he could barely hold the coins. Exhaustion consumed Raymond, transforming him into a mere husk of himself, his movements slow and dragging, his eyes dull and sunken. There was no time to warn anyone, no time to understand what was happening, just a desperate urgency to flee, to get away as quickly as possible. He ran toward the street, away from the building, away from the oblivious crowd, engrossed in their own lives. People looked at him strangely, with irritation, some grumbling about his haste. But he didn't care, couldn't care about anything but his escape. He heard the distant sound of sirens, approaching rapidly, the echo of the catastrophe he had just avoided, confirming his premonition. Later, the news confirmed with the impartial voice of the TV presenter. The tragedy: a gas leak at the top of a skyscraper in the city center. Several people on the upper floor had been affected, some in critical condition, at risk of death. Raymond shivered. Death not only changed traps, but also altitudes, tactics, methods. It pursued him on all levels, in all directions, relentless, creative in its hunt. He found himself in a dark, damp, foul-smelling alley. Gasping for breath, his heart pounding like a furious drum. The graffitied walls of the alley seemed to trap him, suffocate him, and the echo of his own footsteps was the only sound amidst the oppressive silence of the city, a silence that, to him, was the sound of death approaching, step by step. He felt he was reaching his limit, his mind on the verge of collapse, his nerves frayed. How much longer could he continue to flee this endless pursuit? The cold air of Chicago's winter invaded his lungs, and he felt the weight of the world on his shoulders with every breath, every heartbeat, carrying the weight of hundreds of sleepless nights and a constant, crushing fear. Each dawn was a bittersweet reminder that he had survived another day, but also a harbinger of new and unpredictable threats, a silent countdown that inevitably led to his end with every tick of life's clock, every tick-tock nearing zero. He stopped looking for stable work. The fear of staying in one place for too long consumed him like a slow fever, eroding his ability to concentrate and live a normal life. He lived off sporadic, low-paying odd jobs, just enough to eat and have a temporary roof over his head, always in cheap, isolated motels with thin walls and the smell of mold, leaving no trace. Always one step ahead of an invisible enemy. Nights were filled with vivid nightmares of the tunnel, of the suffocating greenish-yellow gas, of the deaths he had witnessed and those he had narrowly avoided. The figure of death, once a cold and distant abstraction, now had a face in his mind, a cold, relentless countenance, with empty eyes that haunted him even when he was awake in broad daylight wherever he was, in any face he encountered. Raymond's paranoia reached unbearable levels, bordering on madness. He distrusted everyone, every glance that watched him, every sound that seemed out of place. He walked the sidewalks, his shoulders slumped under an invisible burden, his eyes fixed on the ground, avoiding eye contact, as if trying to become invisible to the world and to the death that pursued him. One particularly cold morning of a harsh winter in Chicago, the biting air sharp on his face. As he tried to blend into the crowd of tourists and hurried New Yorkers in front of Millennium Park, the smell, that sweet and metallic smell he knew so well, which was the soundtrack to his terror, announcing the presence of death. He looked up, his neck sore and stiff. A towering skyscraper of glass and steel, reflecting Chicago's gray, icy sky, seemed to touch the clouds. The premonition wasn't of a street accident, but of something coming from above, falling, spreading like a toxic cloud. He looked at the top of the building and saw a small, almost imperceptible plume of smoke escaping from one of the upper windows. Gas. a dizzying sensation hit him. The air seemed thin, his lungs refusing to inhale, as if they were closing. Ramon ran. Raymond's journey west was a circular escape, an endless maze. He traded the bus for a train, then the train for a rental car, constantly changing routes, states, and identities, like a ghost condemned to wander, aimless, restless. Raymond was mending an old fence at the edge of the property. In the distorted and blurred reflection of the mirror, a dense, whitish mist began to appear on the horizon, advancing rapidly towards him, like a silent and relentless tsunami, swallowing the arid landscape and the cacti one by one, erasing them from existence. It wasn't dust kicked up by the wind, nor a common cloud of moisture. It was a mist that seemed to drag along the ground, silent and relentless, even under the high sun, under the blue, cloudless sky, defying all natural logic. Raymond felt the air suddenly grow heavy, dense, and the smell sweet, metallic, the smell of death. The smell he knew so well, which pursued him relentlessly, which was his most real nightmare and his constant companion. The same icy sensation that had haunted him since the Ogden Avenue tunnel, which had warned him in Chicago and Kansas. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide in the middle of that open, flat desert, with no trees or buildings for cover, not even a rock to take shelter behind. He tried to scream, a last desperate plea for help, a cry of pure terror, but the sound wouldn't come out, choked by his own throat, by an invisible weight that pressed down on him, crushing him. The mist enveloped him, a white, cold veil that swallowed him whole. And the last thing Raymond felt was an icy shiver, a cold, inescapable embrace, as if the desert, under the midday mist, was holding him forever in a silent, hopeless farewell, in an end that, after all, he could not avoid. Under the desert's strong, merciless sun, the sun beat down on the back of his neck. Can death truly be avoided, or does it always find its way, no matter how far one goes or how fast one runs? Burning his skin, the smell of dry earth and sweat was the only scent in the air, mingled with the smell of old ochre wood, a smell of rural life. He stopped to rest, his back aching and muscles tense, looking at the endless horizon, where the sky merged with the earth in an indistinct line, a landscape that seemed to stretch into eternity. There wasn't a single cloud in the sky, just an intense blue and the scorching desert heat that felt like it was cooking him alive. It was midday. He took a drink of water from his thermos, the cool liquid sliding down his dry, scratchy throat, a small relief. Then, almost out of habit, he looked into the rearview mirror of his old, battered pickup truck, which was parked nearby, reflecting the sun in a dazzling glare. He avoided large cities, preferring rural roads and small, time-forgotten villages, where life seemed slower and people less noticed the presence of strangers. The desert landscape of Arizona, with its spiny cacti, imposing mesas, and vast, boundless sky, offered a false sense of security, an illusion of immensity that he hoped would protect him from death, making him an insignificant particle in the world's vastness. He finally found work as a helper on an isolated farm in the middle of nowhere, miles from any civilization, in a land of dust, relentless sun, and almost absolute silence. The air was clean, the silence almost deafening, broken only by the chirping of desert birds and the occasional howl of the wind. There, he thought, he would finally be safe. He spent weeks on the farm, helping the old farmer, a quiet and experienced man, with deep wrinkles on his face and tired eyes, who seemed not to care about Raymond's mysterious past, only about the work in the fields and the cycle of nature. Life was simple, repetitive, but safe, free from urban dangers, from crowds. No premonition. No sweet smell. No sense of imminent danger. Raymond began to believe that finally he had found a refuge, a safe haven where death would not find him, where he could, perhaps, start a life without fear. He thought that, perhaps, death had grown tired of pursuing him, of their endless game of hide and seek, and had left him in peace. On a hot and sunny afternoon, an implacable heat radiating from the ground and making the air shimmer in invisible waves, and then he saw it. What could have caused this mysterious mist that pursues those who try to cheat fate?